and welcome back. Regular viewers will know that I'm a big fan of the Nik package of plugins, and I'm pleased to announce that DxO have just released a new important update, version 9, that has some interesting and useful new features that makes it even more versatile to work as either a standalone package or as a plugin for various programs. So let's jump in and see what's new. So what's new in Nik Collection 9? Well, here's a summary of the improvements and the new inclusions, and there's one very big important change to the package that I think is the single most important reason why you might want to upgrade to this package. So let's have a quick look at the summary of the new tools. Well, there's been some improvements in the masking and selection area, the most important of which is the inclusion of a depth mask that allows you to select areas within a photograph based on the distance from the camera's viewpoint. Now obviously this is most applicable to landscapes, but it works on other areas as well. So that's a useful new tool. And secondly, there's been some improvements generally to the selection and masking area, one of which is the single click to select area on a area within the photograph, and that seems to work pretty well in the testing that I've done. Now when I talk about AI masks, we're not talking about processing on the cloud or having to use credits that you have to pay for. This is all done on your computer, but using some of these new AI powered tools. And there's been some other additional filters added, the most important of which I think is the color grading tool. And users of Lightroom will be familiar with the color grading panel within Lightroom. And this is a similar type of application, although I think here it works a little bit more seamlessly than the one in Lightroom, and provides all of those tools so that you can do some interesting effects with your color grading. And a couple of other filters that have been added. We have the chromatic shift tool, which is in the analog effects package. We have the glass effect, which is also in the analog effects package. And we have another filter called the halation filter, which is now in the color effects area. And as I mentioned, the color grading is also within color effects. So the most important thing in my book is the inclusion of blending modes within these filters. Now, it applies only to color effects and analog effects, but if you're a Photoshop user, you'll be familiar with blending modes as a tool that allows you to blend filters with the background layer and apply masking and opacity for a lot more creative control. Well, now you can do all of that within the Nik package. So for people who are not comfortable using Photoshop or Affinity Photo, and who may only use things like Lightroom or Photolab, this tool allows you to access all the power of those blending modes within these packages, and that is, in my book, the single most important advance in this package, and makes it absolutely worthwhile the upgrade price, which we will discuss at the end of the video. And there's been some other general improvements. The one that I like the most is the ability to just hover over the presets in the different packages and be able to see the effect applied to your preview image, where previously you actually had to click on the filter to apply it to the image to see whether you liked it or not. Then you've got to either close that filter off and go back, whereas now all you need to do is hover over the preview and you can see it applied to your image, and then decide if you want to use that, and then obviously play with the settings a bit more. So there are some other important additions to the package, and this is just a quick summary of those packages and the improvements. We'll go through each of these shortly with a couple of real-world examples. So how do we access the Nik package? Well, of course, as I mentioned, you can directly open Nik from your computer and drag and drop or open photos from your library directly in the package. But I'm guessing that most people will be using something like a raw processing editor such as Lightroom or Pure Raw or DxO Photolab or any of those, and then you would want to access via Photoshop or directly from within Lightroom. So of course, if you're in Lightroom, all you need to do is right mouse click or select from the photo menu, edit in, and you can go directly into the Nik package. You'll see here I've got Nik version 9 as well as Nik version 8, and you can go directly into Nik from there. And in previous iterations, I've always gone via Photoshop because then I've wanted to use the blending and opacity. But as I mentioned, within this package now, we don't necessarily need to go that way, and we can do it directly from Nik. So if we were going to go directly with a raw file, this is a NEF, Nikon raw file, and we wanted to go to use Nik, let's say we wanted to use the color effects package. What I would need to do then, of course, is to make a copy of this because Nik can't read a raw file, and so we need to make a copy with whatever processing we've done within Lightroom, and the same applies to all of the other packages. So you've got options here. You need to use a TIFF format for going directly from Lightroom into Nik, and then you need to determine the color space. Well, you're not going to use sRGB, are you? We're going to use ProPhoto RGB, and if you're a printer and using an Epson printer, you want 360 DPI, or if you're using a Canon printer, you want 300 DPI. So we could make those settings and click edit. It will create a TIFF version of that file and then open it into the Nik filters. But I'm not going to do that because I'm going to go via Photoshop. I've already opened the file in Photoshop, and we'll just have a look from here because this is the way I would traditionally go through and open the Nik filters. And the reason I've come here is that previously, if you're a user of the older versions of the Nik filter package, you will have had a floating menu that sometimes disappeared down the bottom of the screen, or ended up you drag it around and it covers up other important parts of the workspace. But with the later versions of Nik, you've now got the tools all locked into this little toolbar, and so we can come down and choose each of our packages that we want to work with. So let's say in this instance, let's go into color effects, and it will open color effects. And of course I have two screens here, so I'll need to drag this one over onto the screen, and you'll see here that it's opened up, and this looks all pretty familiar to users of the program. Previously, we've now got our split screen view, but this is where it starts to get interesting. Let's say that I wanted to do something quite radically different, so we can see how the preview works. Let's come down here to, let's choose the midnight options, and if I just hover over that filter, you'll see here the preview changes to that filter. So I don't actually need to click on it to see a preview of what I'm going to do, and it applies to all of the filters within here. Let's have a look at the halation filter, which is one of the new packages, and you see here that we've got all sorts of different effects that obviously not so applicable to this image, but certainly works well. So let's come down to look at one of my favorite packages, which is the tonal contrast. Let's just go to the default settings. Now I could just hover on it to see a preview, or if I click on it, then it opens up the options here to be able to implement it. And you'll see that all it's done is add a bit more color saturation and contrast. And so, but within this panel, I can now see my blending modes. So here's all the blending modes that you will be familiar with. And of course, again, you just need to hover over these to see the effect. And often something like overlay or soft light is a way that you might want to apply this filter. You can see here that it's quite strong, but then of course we have the opacity and the ability also to add local adjustments. In other words, we can make a selection and just apply it to a particular area. So I'm just going to click on the object select, and I'm just going to hover over areas, and you can see now that in this case I've got some fairly distinctive areas that will be selected by the software, and you may need to refine these a little bit, but essentially it's pretty much real time and it makes those selections. So when I make that selection, this is the area where the filter is applied, and this is a valuable tool for then allowing us to look at our blending mode. We've got our opacity, and now we've got a mask or a selection that we can apply to the filter. So this is why I'm excited about this version, because it puts all of these tools that we would otherwise have to use in Photoshop directly within the package. And of course we could then go in and say, all right, well, I've added that filter, I can then go and add another filter on top of that and so forth and build up my image accordingly. So that's how the blending modes, the quick selections, and let's have a look now at adding. We'll get rid of that one because I don't really want that one as well, so I can just delete that mask. But let's now go and look at the depth mask. Now this is really an interesting tool. I'm just going to click on a part of the image, and what I need to do is I'll need to change this blending mode back to normal, and so we can really see the, well, let's change it to darken. We'll make it really opaque, and we've got an area here that has now been selected. And you can see here that it's a very, because I've got that split screen view on, I can just move that right across and we can see the depth. And we have a little tool here that we can change the depth range. And if I bring this forward, this will come all the way to the closest part to the viewpoint, and then we can see how that filter is then working with the depth information in the photograph. And this seems to work really well for landscape photographs. So there's a couple of examples of how these new tools work so well within the Nik package that saves us having to go to blending and extra layers within Photoshop. So let's now jump back to look at one of the other filters. I'm just going to cancel out of that. And one other thing that I should mention is that when you've applied a filter to one of these images here, you can send an individual filter back as a separate layer to Photoshop if you're working in that way, and you can then look at applying those in different ways. But I'm just going to cancel out of that at the moment because I want to just show that even though this blending mode doesn't apply to things like silver effects, you still get the tool that allows you to hover over a particular filter and see its application. Now we'll just zoom back out again, so we've got the full image, and I'm just going to use that split screen, take it right over, and so we can hover on these different filters. And again, you don't need to click on them to select them. But if you want to make adjustments to the presets that come within this, let's just say I've chosen this one, Wet Rocks. Once you click on it, it applies the filter, and then you've got all of these controls here to work with, which applies to all of the other filters. But you don't get the blending modes for silver effects. So if you wanted to use the silver effects in a different way, you would still need to go back to Photoshop. So that's a few of those filters. Let's look at another image now and try a little test out with a couple of those new filters that have been added to the package, which are not going to be applicable to everything, but certainly you may find uses for them. So let's go back into color effects and we'll have a look at that filter. That's the color mixer filter, or the color grading filter, I should say. Here's a photograph of Sydney Harbour that has been processed in Lightroom, but let's have a look at what we can do with the color grading. So if we click on that tool, we've got our split screen. I'll move that over so that we can mostly see what's going on, but here's the effect. Now again, we have our blending mode so that we could try different blending modes. Obviously some of these overlays and soft lights and so forth are quite strong. Let's just leave it at normal for this point of the exercise. And what we have is we have three key areas where we can control the effect of the color grading. So we have the shadows, midtones, highlights, and each of these dots represents each of those ranges. So let's just say we want the blue area, we want the shadows to have a slight blue cast, we want the midtones to be a little bit warmer, and let's say we want the highlights to be quite a lot warmer, and then we've now got quite a different look to our photograph. Now it's your choice as to whether you like this or not, but this is the purpose of the exercise, is to show what we can do. We now also have a balance slider here that determines what we consider to be shadows, midtones and highlights. So if I move it more over towards the shadow area, it's going to consider nearly all of the images being shadows. Obviously midtones is fairly balanced, or I can move it all the way over to the highlights, and so we can get quite a lot of control over the effect. And once we've selected these points, we've now got a little handle here, and so we can move that white point around the hues, different colors, and then of course by moving it in and out we can be more subtle with our color toning, or obviously stronger as we go towards the edge of the circle. So that's the color grading, and of course we can also add the same object selections. And as I move this around, and again in this example we've got fairly clear distinction between the buildings and the background, and you'll see that not necessarily is it selecting the sky perfectly, but we have other tools that we can then use to tweak that a little bit more. But certainly when it comes to making individual selections, we've now got this area selected, this particular building, and you'll see that that filter is only applying to that building. So if you wanted to do something a little bit tricky and say, okay, well I wanted everything else but that building selected, we can come down to our filter and we can just look at that, and we can invert it. We've got some other little tools here. We've got the color overlay, but we've got a tool here that says we can invert that mask. If I select it, of course, it'll make a big difference. I can select that mask and invert it, so that sometimes you want to select an area that you want to exclude from the filter rather than include, and we've got that ability to change that. So you can see now that I made that selection on this building, and I've now inverted it so that the filter applies to everything except the building. So this is quite a handy tool to have. So that's the color grading tool. Let's close that off. We won't use that again. And let's look at, well, the halation tool really works where you've got quite bright highlights, but let's just have a look here and see how that works. We'll click on it, and well, we've got some rather bizarre sort of glowing areas, but what we've got here is some tools, and I've turned on the coloration slider here, and you can see here we've got the option of putting a radioactive glow on the buildings if we wanted to, and move through the whole range of colors. Well, let's turn that off. So here's a better example for trying out that halation filter. I thought it was a bit unfair to try it just on that cityscape. Here's a photograph taken in Osaka on our recent trip to Japan, and this one was actually taken on a not-so-smartphone. And let's have a look at that filter and see what it is. Now, if you've got masks applied to an image layer here, when you go to enter these filters, you will be asked to see whether you wanted to select any masks or not. I'm not going to select any of those. I want to apply this to the whole image, and of course Nik will go ahead and create this extra filter, and you will see, because we're zoomed in here, that the detail is pretty smeary. If you're used to the quality from a digital camera, the smartphone images, while they look fine on a small screen, once you start to enlarge them, they start to break up. But that's another story for another day. Let's have a look at this halation filter, because it's quite an interesting filter. And again, we've gone into the filter and we have this colorization filter turned on. Let's have a look. We could make it look like something really bizarre. Let's just turn that coloration off for the moment. And again, it's going to pick out the highlight areas in the photograph. If I go all the way off, you'll see that this is the base image, and then as I boost that up, you can start to see the effect, which is quite pleasing in this particular photograph, and it helps to create a little bit more atmosphere. And you can see then if I use the spread tool, it starts to get a bit too wild. You don't want to go that far. We can keep it fairly restricted and just find the areas that we want, and then we can adjust the sensitivity as to how many highlights it's going to find. And in that case, that halation filter has quite a nice effect, and I think it works quite well where you have these highlights and bright areas, particularly in nighttime photographs. So that's the halation filter. Let's look now at the other filters in analog effects. So let's now go back to this photograph of the standing stones on the Isle of Lewis and Harris and have a look at these couple of other filters that occur within analog effects. And if you're not familiar with analog effects, there's a broad range of different filters available here. We're just going to look at the new ones in this particular video because there are so many different ones to go into. And when you go into analog effects, by default it's going to always apply these basic adjustments here, and you've got details you can apply here, such as detail extractor, brightness, contrast, saturation, and you can also of course use blend modes and local adjustments. I'm not going to touch any of those. We're just going to come down and have a look at firstly the chromatic shift filter, which I'm sure there will be applications for this for people wanting to do something a little bit different. This looks pretty much like you used to get on your old television set when things weren't quite working correctly, but of course you can play around this. You get a little spot in the center here. You can drag that around to different locations. No, you can't. You can just drag the effect around, and the amount of offset you can make is quite distinct. And then of course you've got different options here. You've got green, magenta, and different sort of controls as to how you're going to affect that. Now it's one of those filters that you'll find some uses for. This is probably not the best example, but let's close that off and let's have a look at the other one, which I think is quite interesting, which is the glass effect filter. And again, we have our blend modes, we have the ability to apply a local adjustment, but in this case I think that this filter or series of filters probably works best over the whole image. Now you'll see we've got a bit of a preview area here. Let's just zoom in a little bit, and then we can see the effect. Now this is the first filter. We have the strength amount. If we go back to 0, there's no effect. We go 100%, it's quite a strong effect, so let's just leave that in the middle. We have a smoothness slider that affects how the filter is applied and how much detail we get out of it. And more importantly, we've got a zoom slider here, so we can start from, in this particular one, it's like horizontal bands. We can make them very fine, and we can use the zoom slider to make it quite large. Let's just zoom back out a little bit more so we can see. And some of these are quite interesting. If you wanted to get a strange old-fashioned glass effect, again, you can of course use your local adjustments to apply to just part of the image, but you can see that there are probably some uses for some of these filters that might otherwise just be there as a bit of a gimmick, but you can play around with these to your heart's content and create some interesting effects. So that's the other two filters that are now added to analog effects, and of course with the local adjustments, and of course our blending modes. And this is, as I said, the most important addition to this tool set is the ability to now blend this in different ways to our image. So that's a very brief summary of the new tools and the advancements in Nik Collection 9. These are the summary of the effects that have been added, or the enhancements that have been added. So the $64,000 question is, what is the cost of this program going forward? Well, we can see here that this is the pricing that's applicable for either an upgrade or a new license. These are the prices in dollars, euros or pounds. If you're in Australia, you can add about 50% to the euro price and you'll get an idea of that it's roughly 140, 150 Australian dollars. But importantly, if you would like to get a discount on either the upgrade or the new package price by going to the DxO website and putting in the code PhotoTutor on checkout, you will get your 15% discount. So that will take about another $20 off the upgrade price. And I'm assuming if you've got one of the previous versions, either 7 or 8, you can upgrade for around 120 Australian dollars, which is a permanent license, not just an annual subscription. And I think that's entirely reasonable. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I think this is a great new package, and it will be available after the 21st of April. And thanks to DxO for supporting this video, and I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you again soon.